The hillside lay above a shallow valley where the ground sloped unevenly, shaped by years of rain and frost. Grass grew thin in places, interrupted by rock and scrub. Trees clustered lower down, where soil gathered and water held. From above, the view opened wide, but it offered little protection. Wind moved freely across the slope, unobstructed, carrying sound and smoke farther than expected. There was no road nearby. The nearest settlement sat beyond a series of ridges, out of sight. Footpaths existed only where animals passed repeatedly, wearing narrow lines into the grass. At night, the temperature dropped quickly. In daylight, the sun exposed the hillside without mercy, leaving little shade except where brush thickened near stone outcrops. From a distance, smoke sometimes rose from the slope. It was thin and inconsistent, not the steady column associated with a house or cabin. Those who noticed it assumed something simple: a small dwelling, a hunting shelter, or a fire set by someone passing through. In rural areas, such signs were rarely questioned. But the hillside held no structure. There were no walls, no roof, no cleared foundation. What shelter existed was improvised and temporary, altered frequently to avoid permanence. The land bore no markers of ownership or habitation. It was not a place designed for living, only for passing through. Silence dominated the area. Wind through grass, birds lifting and settling. No mechanical sound, no voices. The environment was indifferent, neither hostile nor welcoming. It offered resources in fragments and demanded effort for every gain. At first glance, nothing about the hillside suggested endurance. And yet, signs of continued presence appeared, faint and easily overlooked, carried away again by weather and time. He was 17 when he left home. There was no formal departure, no recorded date or official intervention. Accounts that exist describe a gradual breakdown rather than a single decisive moment. Family relationships had deteriorated over time. Conflict, instability, and limited resources shaped the household he came from. By the time he left, there was no clear path back. This occurred in a rural region where social services were minimal and expectations of self-reliance were high. Teenagers were often treated as adults long before they were prepared to be. For those who fell outside family structures, options were narrow. Temporary work, seasonal labor, or informal arrangements were common. For someone without steady connections, even these were difficult to secure. He did not leave with a plan to disappear. There is no evidence he intended long-term isolation. Contemporary records suggest he moved between temporary locations at first, staying briefly with acquaintances or sleeping outdoors. The hillside came later, chosen less as a destination than as an absence of alternatives. At 17, he was legally a minor, but enforcement was inconsistent. Rural authorities often intervened only when a clear disturbance occurred. A quiet young person who avoided towns and did not ask for assistance could remain unnoticed for long periods. This invisibility was not strategic at first. It was circumstantial. He carried little with him. What possessions he had were practical and limited. Clothing suitable for work, basic tools, and small personal items. There was no camping equipment designed for extended use. No formal training in wilderness survival. His situation differed from that of explorers or backcountry travelers. He was not seeking challenge or testing endurance. He was attempting to persist. The decision to remain near the hillside was shaped by familiarity and distance. It was far enough from populated areas to avoid attention, but close enough to observe patterns of movement below. He could see when people passed and when they did not. This balance reduced risk, at least initially. Over time, the temporary solution hardened into routine. Days accumulated without a clear endpoint. The absence of intervention allowed the situation to continue. What began as displacement gradually became a form of unrecognized survival, unfolding without witnesses or documentation. At this stage, nothing marked the situation as extraordinary. It resembled quiet poverty rather than crisis. The scale of what would follow was not yet apparent. The skills he carried into isolation were unremarkable and incomplete. He had grown up around manual labor and rural routines, absorbing knowledge indirectly rather than through instruction. He knew how to light a fire. He understood basic weather patterns. He recognized edible plants in a general sense, though not with certainty. This was familiarity, not training. There is no evidence he had been taught wilderness survival in any formal way. He had not prepared for extended exposure. He did not possess maps, compasses, or preserved food. His understanding of the land was practical and local, shaped by observation rather than planning. What he knew was enough to get through a night. It was not enough to ensure safety over months or years. His education had been interrupted early. School records, where they exist, suggest irregular attendance. Like many in similar circumstances, learning had been secondary to immediate needs. Work, when available, was physical and short-term. Problem-solving was situational. Decisions were made for the present day, not the future. He did not initially consider himself hidden. He did not believe he was living outside society. The hillside was close enough to farms and paths that he assumed he would be noticed eventually. The smoke from his fire was visible. He did not attempt to mask it at first. The absence of response reinforced a false assumption that someone knew he was there. This misunderstanding shaped his early behavior. He did not conserve resources aggressively. He did not build permanent shelter. He moved frequently, following convenience rather than strategy. These choices were not careless. They were based on the belief that the situation was temporary. What he lacked most was information. He did not know how long he could remain undetected. He did not understand how quickly exposure would compound. He underestimated the cumulative effect of cold, hunger, and fatigue. These were not immediate threats. They advanced slowly without dramatic onset. The hillside offered lessons incrementally. Small failures corrected his expectations. Fires burned longer than planned. Food sources disappeared. Weather shifted without warning. Each adjustment required learning through consequence rather than foresight. At 17, adaptability existed, but judgment was still forming. He responded to conditions as they appeared, not as they developed. This gap between reaction and anticipation would define the transition from temporary displacement to sustained survival. The limits of what he knew were not immediately visible. They revealed themselves over time, as options narrowed and mistakes became harder to recover from. The fire began as a practical act. It was built low on the slope, partially shielded by uneven ground and brush. Dry grass and fallen branches were easy to gather. The flame provided warmth, a way to cook what little food he had, and light after dark. It also produced smoke, thin but visible, rising above the hillside and drifting into the valley below. At first, this did not concern him. In rural areas, smoke was common. Farmers burned debris. Hunters lit small fires. The presence of smoke usually indicated nothing more than temporary activity. He assumed the same interpretation would apply here. What he did not yet understand was how observers filled in gaps. People who noticed the smoke did not investigate. They assumed a structure existed just out of view. A cabin, a shed, some form of shelter that explained the fire and required no further thought. The smoke was not read as a signal of need. It was read as evidence of normal habitation. This misunderstanding became the turning point. The fire marked his presence while simultaneously obscuring his situation. It reassured others that nothing was wrong. In doing so, it delayed discovery. Over time, the fire became essential. Nights grew colder. Food required cooking to be edible or safe. Without shelter, heat loss was constant. The fire compensated for what the environment did not provide. But it also anchored him to the hillside. He could not travel far without risking the loss of warmth and light. Gradually, he became aware that no one was coming. Days passed, then weeks. Smoke continued to rise, and no response followed. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly, as an absence rather than an event. This was the point at which the situation changed. Not because of a single mistake, but because an assumption failed. He understood that visibility did not guarantee attention, that being seen was not the same as being recognized. Leaving the hillside now carried greater risk. He had few resources stored elsewhere. Weather conditions had worsened. His physical condition had already begun to decline. What had been a temporary arrangement now required continuity. The fire burned on. It marked the location of a life without shelter, mistaken for one that had it. From that moment forward, survival was no longer incidental. It became deliberate. Once it became clear that the hillside was not being monitored or questioned, his behavior changed. The shift was gradual, shaped by repetition rather than intention. Each day followed the same basic pattern, adjusted slightly for weather and physical condition. He woke with daylight. He tended the remains of the fire. He searched for materials before moving too far from its warmth. Shelter was improvised rather than constructed. He used natural depressions in the ground, clusters of brush, and rock faces that broke the wind. These locations changed frequently. Remaining in one place for too long increased exposure to weather and the risk of leaving visible traces. Movement reduced both. Nothing was permanent enough to suggest habitation. Fire management became central. He learned to keep flames low and contained, feeding them slowly to conserve fuel. Larger fires burned hotter but required constant attention and more material. Smaller ones were easier to control and less visible. He adjusted based on conditions, extinguishing fires completely when wind increased or rain threatened. Daily movement followed a loose perimeter. He avoided established paths and areas where signs of passage were clear. Instead, he moved along irregular routes, using terrain to remain unseen from below. This was not a calculated effort to hide at first. It became one over time, as he recognized patterns in how and when people moved through nearby areas. Food gathering took place in short windows. He did not store much. Carrying excess weight slowed him, and spoilage was a constant risk. What he found was consumed quickly. This created a cycle of scarcity that governed his schedule. Energy was spent cautiously, measured against uncertain return. Water sources were limited but consistent. Small streams and runoff collected lower on the slope. Reaching them required descending and climbing again, which increased fatigue. He learned to time these trips carefully, avoiding the hottest parts of the day when exertion was costly. The absence of shelter meant the environment dictated rest. Sleep was fragmented. Cold interrupted it. Noise startled him awake. He learned to rest in shorter intervals, conserving energy where possible. This pattern reduced recovery but allowed alertness. Over time, his presence became lighter. Footprints faded before they were noticed. Fire sites were scattered and abandoned. What remained behind resembled the traces of passing animals more than human activity. This invisibility was not absolute. It depended on weather, terrain, and chance. But it was sufficient. No one came to the hillside. No one questioned the smoke closely enough to investigate its source. Living without recognition altered perception. Days were marked by tasks rather than dates. Progress was measured in endurance, not improvement. There was no sense of advancement, only continuation. The hillside did not offer stability. It offered repetition. Through routine, he reduced uncertainty, even as his condition slowly declined. Survival became an ongoing process rather than a response to crisis. He lived where no one was looking, not because he intended to disappear, but because absence had proven effective. Food acquisition became more difficult as seasons changed. What had been available in warmer months diminished or disappeared. Plants that had once provided occasional sustenance were no longer accessible. Small animals altered their patterns. Insects vanished. The hillside offered less with each passing week. He adjusted by expanding the area he covered, though cautiously. Greater distance increased the chance of discovery and the cost of return. Each trip required calculation. Energy spent searching had to be justified by what it might yield. Often it was not. Hunger became a constant condition rather than an emergency. Weather imposed additional limits. Rain soaked clothing that could not be properly dried. Cold penetrated without resistance. Wind increased heat loss, forcing longer reliance on fire. Fuel became harder to collect as accessible dry material was exhausted. He learned to break larger branches and expose inner wood, but this required strength he no longer had in abundance. Time lost its structure. Without external reference points, days blurred together. Weather cycles replaced calendars. Hunger marked the passage of hours more reliably than light. Physical decline was gradual. Weight loss was steady. Muscle weakened. Minor injuries healed slowly or not at all. Despite this, routine persisted. He maintained basic order in his movements and tasks. Fires were built with care. Water was collected regularly. He avoided unnecessary risk. These actions did not improve conditions, but they prevented rapid deterioration. Cold nights became the greatest challenge. Without insulation, sleep was brief and shallow. He learned to rest during daylight when possible, using the sun for warmth. This inversion reduced exposure but further separated him from normal rhythms. The hillside was quiet during the day, active only with wind and distant movement. At night, cold and darkness confined him. Clothing wore down. Repairs were crude and temporary. Fabric tore faster than it could be mended. Exposure increased accordingly. Each layer lost reduced his margin for error. There were no replacements. Mental strain was present but contained. There is no record of panic or erratic behavior. Survival depended on restraint. He did not expend energy imagining outcomes. Attention remained on immediate needs. This focus limited despair but also narrowed perspective. Long-term planning became irrelevant. Storms forced adaptation. Heavy rain extinguished fires and erased tracks. Snow, when it came, changed the landscape entirely. Familiar paths vanished. Resources were buried. Movement slowed. Fire became more visible against white ground, increasing risk of attention. Yet still, no one came. Smoke rose and dispersed. Observers, if there were any, continued to assume a structure that did not exist. Time continued without acknowledgement. The hillside changed, and he changed with it. Survival was not sustained by improvement, but by minimizing loss. Each day ended without resolution. Each morning required the same effort to begin again. This was endurance without progress. Food, weather, and time worked against him incrementally. What remained constant was the requirement to continue, without indication that conditions would change. As conditions worsened, avoidance became more deliberate. What had once been incidental invisibility turned into a discipline shaped by observation and correction. He learned when to move and when to remain still. He noted patterns in the valley below, the times when distant activity increased, the days when none appeared at all. Remaining unseen reduced immediate risk, but it also imposed limits. He could not approach structures or roads, even when supplies were visible from a distance. The cost of being noticed outweighed the benefit of intervention. At some point, he understood that discovery would not be neutral. Questions would follow. Explanations would be required. He did not believe he had any that would resolve the situation safely. Fire use was adjusted again. Flames were kept smaller, often reduced to embers. Smoke was minimized by careful selection of fuel. Wet material was avoided, even when dry wood was scarce. Fires were sometimes delayed until nightfall, when visibility was lower and air movement dispersed smoke more evenly. Movement slowed further. Energy conservation became a priority. He limited travel to essential tasks only. Exploration ceased. Familiar ground, though depleted, was safer than unknown terrain. This reduced exposure but increased scarcity. The trade-off was accepted. Psychological pressure did not present as fear in any obvious sense. It appeared instead as narrowing focus. Attention remained on immediate actions. There was little evidence of reflection or planning beyond the next few hours. This was not resignation, but containment. By limiting scope, he reduced the weight of uncertainty. Isolation altered perception of risk. Injury became more dangerous than hunger. A twisted ankle or deep cut would have ended mobility entirely. As a result, he avoided steep descents and unstable ground, even when resources were visible below. Caution overruled opportunity. He learned to observe weather closely. Subtle changes in wind direction informed decisions about fire. Cloud cover dictated rest or movement. These observations were not scientific but experiential. Mistakes were corrected through consequence. The hillside itself became a form of cover. From certain angles, smoke was invisible. From others, it carried far. He adjusted accordingly. Fires were built in different locations depending on conditions. No single site was used long enough to establish a pattern. This invisibility was fragile. It depended on constant attention. A single lapse could have altered everything. Yet the absence of interruption reinforced the strategy. Each day without discovery confirmed, falsely or not, that avoidance was working. Over time, this discipline reduced options further. Reaching out became less likely. Remaining unseen became the default. The possibility of assistance receded, not because it was unavailable, but because it was no longer sought. The hillside held him in place through this balance of risk and restraint. Survival continued, not through strength or ingenuity, but through careful limitation. Staying invisible was not a goal. It was the condition under which endurance remained possible.